Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. I hope this evening I will be able to read without accidentally pressing stop at any point and having to repeat myself. The saga continues. Chapter 7. A Retrospection. Left now to herself, sensations unfelt before filled the heart of Cecilia. All that had passed for a while appeared to a dream. Her ideas were indistinct, her memory was confused, her faculties seemed all out of order, and she had but an imperfect consciousness either of the transaction in which she had just been engaged, or of the promise she had bound herself to fulfil. Even truth from imagination she scarcely could separate. All was darkness and doubt, inquietude and disorder. But when at length her recollection more clearly returned, and her situation appeared to her such as it really was, divested alike of false terrors or delusional expectations, she found herself still further removed from tranquillity. Hitherto, though no stranger to sorrow, which the sickness and early loss of her friends had first taught her to feel, and which the subsequent anxiety of her own heart had since instructed her to bear, she had yet invariably possessed the consolation of self-approving reflections. But the step she was now about to take, all her principles opposed. It terrified her as undutiful, it shocked her as clandestine, and scarce was Delvile out of sight before she regretted her consent to it as the loss of her self-esteem, and believed even if a reconciliation took place, the remembrance of a wilful fault would still follow her, blemish her in her own eyes the character she had hoped to support, and be a constant ally to her happiness, by telling her how unworthily she had obtained it. Where frailty has never been voluntary, nor error stubborn, where the pride of early integrity is unsubdued, and the first purity of innocence is inviolate, how fearfully delicate, how tremblingly alive is the conscience of man! Strange, that what in its first state is so tender, can in its last become so callous. Compared with the general lot of human misery, Cecilia had suffered nothing, but compared with the exaltation of ideal happiness, she had suffered much. Willingly, however, would she again have borne all that had distressed her, experienced the same painful suspense, endured the same melancholy parting, and gone through the same cruel task of combating inclination with reason, to have relieved her virtuous mind from the new-born and intolerable terror of conscientious reproaches. The equity of her notions permitted her not from the earnestness of Delvile's entreaties to draw any palliation for her consent to his proposal. She was conscious that but for her own too great facility those entreaties would have been ineffectual, since she well knew how little from any other of her admirers they would have availed. But chiefly her affliction and repentance hung upon Mrs Delvile, whom she loved, reverenced, and honoured, whom she dreaded to offend, and whom she well knew expected from her even exemplary virtue. Her praises, her partiality, her confidence in her character, which hitherto had been her pride, she now only recollected with shame and with sadness. The terror of the first interview never ceased to be present to her. She shrunk even in imagination from her wrath-darting eye. She felt stung by pointed satire, and subdued by cold contempt. Yet to disappoint Delvile so late, by forfeiting a promise so positively accorded, to trifle with a man who to her had been uniformly candid, to waver when her word was engaged, and retreat when he thought himself secure. Honour, justice, and shame told her the time was now past. And yet is not this, cried she, placing nominal before actual evil? Is it not studying appearance at the expense of reality? If agreeing to wrong is criminal, is not performing it worse? If repentance for ill actions calls for mercy, has not repentance for ill intentions a yet higher claim? And what reproaches from Delvile can be so bitter as my own? What separation, what sorrow, what possible calamity can hang upon my mind with such heaviness as the sense of committing voluntary evil? This thought so much affected her, that conquering all regret either for Delvile or herself, she resolved to write to him instantly, and acquaint him of the alteration in her sentiments. This, however, after having so deeply engaged herself, was by no means easy, and many letters were begun, but not one of them was finished, when a sudden recollection obliged her to give over the attempt, for she knew not whither to direct to him. In the haste with which their plan had been formed and settled, it had never once occurred to them that any occasion for writing was likely to happen. Delvile indeed knew that her address would still be the same, and with regard to his own, as his journey to London was to be secret, he purposed not having any fixed habitation. On the day of their marriage, and not before, they had appointed to meet at the house of Mrs. Roberts in Fetter Lane, whence they were instantly to proceed to the church. She might still indeed enclose a letter for him in one to Mrs. Hill, to be delivered to him on the destined morning when he called to claim her, but to fail him at the last moment, when Mr. Belfield would have drawn up the bond, when a licence was procured, the clergyman waiting to perform the ceremony, and Delvile without a suspicion but that the next moment would unite them for ever, seemed extending prudence into treachery and power into tyranny. Delvile had done nothing to merit such treatment. He had practised no deceit. He had been guilty of no perfidy. He had opened to her his whole heart, and after showing it without any disguise, the option had been all her own to accept or refuse him. A ray of joy now broke its way through the gloom of her apprehensions. "Ah," cried she, "I have not, then, any means to recede. An unprovoked breach of promise at the very moment destined for its performance would but vary the mode of acting wrong without approaching nearer to acting right." This idea for a while not merely calmed but delighted her. To be the wife of Delvile seemed now a matter of necessity, and she soothed herself with believing that to struggle against it were vain. The next morning, during breakfast, Mr. Monckton arrived. Not greater, though winged with joy, had been the expedition of Delvile to open to him his plan, than was his own, though only goaded by desperation, to make some effort with Cecilia for rendering it abortive. Nor could all his self-denial, the command which he held over his passions, nor the rigour with which his feelings were made subservient to his interest, in this sudden hour of trial avail to preserve his equanimity. The refinements of hypocrisy and the arts of insinuation offered advantages too distant and exacted attentions too subtle for a moment so alarming. Those arts and those attentions he had already for many years practised with an address the most masterly, and a diligence the most indefatigable. Success had of late seemed to follow his toils, the increasing infirmities of his wife, the disappointment and retirement of Cecilia, uniting to promise him a conclusion equally speedy and happy, when now, by a sudden and unexpected stroke, the sweet solace of his future cares, the long projected recompense of his past sufferings, was to be snatched from him for ever, and by one who, compared with himself, was but the acquaintance of a day. Almost wholly off his guard from the surprise and horror of this apprehension, he entered the room with such an air of haste and perturbation, that Mrs. Charlton and her granddaughters demanded what was the matter. "I am come," he answered abruptly, yet endeavouring to recollect himself, "to speak with Miss Beverley upon a business of some importance." "My dear, then," said Mrs. Charlton, "you had better go with Mr. Monkton into your dressing-room." Cecilia, deeply blushing, arose and led the way. Slowly, however, she proceeded, though urged by Mr. Monkton to make speed. Certain of his disapprobation, and but doubtfully relieved from her own, she dreaded a conference which on his side she foresaw would be all exhortation and reproof, and on hers all timidity and shame. "Good God!" he cried. "Miss Beverley, what is this you have done? Bound yourself to marry a man who despises, who discorns, who refuses to own you." Shocked by this opening, she started, but could make no answer. "See you not," he continued, "the indignity which is offered you? Does the flimsy veil with which it is covered hide it from your understanding, or disguise it from your delicacy?" "I thought not, I meant not," said she, more and more confounded, "to submit to any indignity, though my pride in an exigence so peculiar may give way for a while to convenience." "To convenience?" repeated he. "To contempt, to derision, to insolence." "Oh, Mr. Monkton," interrupted Cecilia, "make not use of such expressions. They were too cruel for me to hear, and if I thought they were just, would make me miserable for life." "You are deceived, grossly deceived," replied he, "if you doubt their truth for a moment. They are not, indeed, even decently concealed from you. They are glaring as the day, and wilful blindness can alone obscure them." "I am sorry, sir," said Cecilia, whose confusion at a charge so rough began now to give way to anger, "if this is your opinion, and I am sorry too for the liberty I have taken in troubling you upon such a subject." An apology so full of displeasure instantly taught Mr. Monckton the error he was committing, and checking therefore the violence of those emotions to which his sudden and desperate disappointment gave rise, and which betrayed him into reproaches so unskilful, he endeavoured to recover his accustomed equanimity, and assuming an air of friendly openness, he said, "Let me not offend you, my dear Miss Beverley, by a freedom which results merely from a solicitude to serve you, and which the length and intimacy of our acquaintance had, I hoped, long since authorized. I know not how to see you on the brink of destruction without speaking, yet if you are averse to my sincerity, I will curb it and have done." "No, do not have done," cried she, much softened. "Your sincerity does me nothing but honour, and hitherto I am sure it has done me nothing but good. Perhaps I deserve your utmost censure. I feared it indeed before you came, and ought therefore to have better prepared myself for meeting with it." This speech completed Mr. Monckton's self-victory. It showed him not only the impropriety of his turbulence, but gave him room to hope that a mildness more crafty would have better success. "You cannot but be certain," he answered, "that my zeal proceeds wholly from a desire to be of use to you. My knowledge of the world might possibly, I thought, assist your inexperience, and the disinterestedness of my regard. You might enable me to see and to point out the dangers to which you are exposed, from artifice and duplicity in those who have other purposes to answer than what simply belongs to your welfare." "Neither artifice nor duplicity," cried Cecilia, jealous for the honour of Delvile, "have been practised against me. Argument and not persuasion determined me, and if I have done wrong, those who prompted me have erred as unwittingly as myself." "You are too generous to perceive the difference, or you would find nothing less alike. If, however, my plainness will not offend you, before it is quite too late, I will point out to you a few of these evils, for there are some I cannot even mention, which at this instant do not merely threaten but await you." Cecilia started at this terrifying offer, and afraid to accept, yet ashamed to refuse it, hung back irresolute. "I see," said Mr. Monckton, after a pause of some continuance, "your determination admits no appeal. The consequence must indeed be all your own, but I am greatly grieved to find how little you are aware of its seriousness. Hereafter you will wish, perhaps, that the friend of your earliest youth had been permitted to advise you. At present you only think him officious and impertinent, and therefore he can do nothing you will not be so likely to approve as quitting you. I wish you then greater happiness than seems prepared to follow you, and a counsellor more prosperous in offering his assistance." He would then have taken his leave, but Cecilia called out, "Oh, Mr. Monckton, do you then give me up?" "Not unless you wish it." "Alas, I know not what to wish, except indeed the restoration of that security from self-blame, which till yesterday, even in the midst of disappointment, quieted and consoled me." "Are you then sensible you have gone wrong, yet resolute not to turn back?" "Could I tell, could I see," cried she with energy, "which way I ought to turn, not a moment would I hesitate how to act. My heart should have no power, my happiness no choice. I would recover my own esteem by any sacrifice that could be made." "What, then, can be your doubt? To be as you were yesterday, what is wanting but your own inclination?" "Everything is wanting. Right, honour, firmness, all by which the just abound, and all which the conscientious hold sacred. These scruples are merely romantic. Your own good sense, had it fairer play, would have contemned them, but it is warped at present by prejudice and possession." "No, indeed," cried she, colouring at the charge. "I may have entered too precipitately into an engagement I ought to have avoided, but it is weakness of judgment, not of heart, that disables me from retrieving my error." "Yet you will neither hear whither it may lead you, nor which way you may escape from it." "Yes, sir," cried she, trembling, "I am now ready to hear both." "Briefly, then, I will tell you. It will lead you into a family of which every individual will disdain you. It will make you inmate of a house of which no other inmate will associate with you. You will be insulted as an inferior and reproached as an intruder. Your birth will be a subject of ridicule, and your whole race only named with derision. And while the elders of the proud castle treat you with open contempt, the man for whom you suffer will not dare to support you." "Impossible! Impossible!" cried Cecilia with the most angry emotion. "This whole representation is exaggerated, and the latter part is entirely without foundation. The latter part, said Mr. Monckton, is of all other least disputable. The man who now dares not own will then never venture to defend you. On the contrary, to make peace for himself, he will be the first to neglect you. The ruined estates of his ancestors will be repaired by your fortune, while the name which you carry into his family will be constantly resented as an injury. You will thus be plundered though you are scorned, and told to consider yourself honoured that they condescend to make use of you. Nor here rests the evil of a forced connection with so much arrogance. Even your children, should you have any, will be educated to despise you. Dreadful and horrible, cried Cecilia. I can hear no more. Oh, Mr. Monkton, what a prospect have you opened to my view! Fly from it, then, while it is yet in your power. When two paths are before you, choose not that which leads to destruction. Send instantly after Delvile, and tell him you have recovered your senses. I would long since have sent. I wanted not a representation such as this, but I know not how to direct to him, nor whither he is gone. All art and baseness to prevent your recantation. No, sir, no, cried she with quickness. Whatever may be the truth of your painting in general, all that concerns. Ashamed of the vindication she intended, which yet in her own mind was firm and animated, she stopped and left the sentence unfinished. In what place were you to meet? Said Mr. Monkton. You can at least send to him there. We were only to have met, answered she in much confusion, at the last moment, and that would be too late. It would be too... I could not, without some previous notice, break a promise which I gave without any restriction. Is this your only objection? It is, but it is one which I cannot conquer. Then you would give up this ill-boding connection, but from notions of delicacy with regard to the time. Indeed, I meant it before you came. I, then, will obviate this objection. Give me but the commission, either verbally or in writing, and I will undertake to find him out and deliver it before night. Cecilia, little expecting this offer, turned extremely pale, and after pausing some moments, said in a faltering voice, What then, sir, is your advice? In what manner? I will say to him all that is necessary. Trust the matter with me. No, he deserves at least an apology from myself, though how to make it? She stopped, she hesitated, she went out of the room for pen and ink, she returned without them, and the agitation of her mind every instant increasing, she begged him in a faint voice to excuse her while she consulted with Mrs. Charlton, and promising to wait upon him again, was hurrying away. Mr. Monkton, however, saw too great danger in so much emotion to trust her out of his sight. He told her, therefore, that she would only increase her perplexity without reaping any advantage by an application to Mrs. Charlton, and that if she was really sincere in wishing to recede, there was not a moment to be lost, and Delvile should immediately be pursued. Cecilia, sensible of the truth of this speech, and once more recollecting the unaffected earnestness with which but an hour or two before she had herself desired to renounce this engagement, now summoned her utmost courage to her aid, and after a short but painful struggle, determined to act consistently with her professions and her character, and by one great and final effort to conclude all her doubts, and try to silence even her regret by completing the triumph of fortitude over inclination. She called, therefore, for pen and ink, and without venturing herself from the room, wrote the following letter. To Mortimer Delvile, Esquire. Accuse me not of caprice, and pardon my irresolution, when you find me shrinking with terror from the promise I have made, and no longer either able or willing to perform it. The reproaches of your family I should very ill endure, but the reproaches of my own heart for an action I can neither approve nor defend would be still more oppressive. With such a weight upon the mind, length of life would be burdensome. With a sensation of guilt, early death would be terrific. These being my notions of the engagement into which we have entered, you cannot wonder, and you have still less reason to repine, that I dare not fulfil it. Alas! Where would be your chance of happiness with one who in the very act of becoming yours would forfeit her own? I blush at this tardy recantation, and I grieve at the disappointment it may occasion you, but I have yielded to the exhortations of an inward monitor who is never to be neglected with impunity. Consult him yourself, and I shall need no other advocate. Adieu, and may all felicity attend you. if to hear of the almost total privation of mine will mitigate the resentment with which you will probably read this letter, it may be mitigated but too easily. Yet my consent to a clandestine action shall never be repeated. And though I confess to you I am not happy, I solemnly declare my resolution is unalterable. A little reflection will tell you I am right, though a great deal of lenity will scarce suffice to make you pardon my being right no sooner. C.B. This letter, which with trembling haste, resulting from a fear of her own steadiness, she folded and sealed, Mr. Monckton, from the same apprehension, yet more eagerly received, and scarce waiting to bid her good morning, mounted his horse and pursued his way to London. Cecilia returned to Mrs. Charlton to acquaint her with what had passed, and notwithstanding the sorrow she felt in apparently injuring the man whom, in the whole world, she most wished to oblige, she yet found a satisfaction in the sacrifice she had made, that recompensed her for much of her sufferings, and soothed her into something like tranquillity. The true power of virtue she had scarce experienced before, but she found it a resource against the cruellest dejection, and a supporter in the bitterest disappointment. It's really tricky, isn't it? I mean, I can't see that she could have acted any other than she did. And I can't see that any relationship that began on such shaky grounds has a chance of succeeding. I don't think I could act that way. I don't think I could agree to something that I knew in my heart was against my character and not right. And I think, although Monkton is absolutely vile, he's not wrong that Delvile, in refusing to own Cecilia and stand up to his parents immediately, is not necessarily setting himself up for being able to defend her against them later, if needed. So I think there's a very clear action that Delvile has to take before he is going to be able to claim Cecilia. And there is a confrontation that needs to happen. Chapter 8. An Embarrassment. The day passed on without any intelligence. The next day also passed in the same manner, and on the third, which was her birthday, Cecilia became of age. The preparations which had long been making among her tenants to celebrate this event, Cecilia appeared to take some share, and endeavoured to find some pleasure in. She gave a public dinner to all who were willing to partake of it. She promised redress to those who complained of hard usage. She pardoned many debts and distributed money, food, and clothing to the poor. These benevolent occupations made time seem less heavy, and while they freed her from solitude, diverted her suspense. She still, however, continued at the house of Mrs. Charlton, the workmen having disappointed her in finishing her own. Nothing changes. But in defiance of her utmost exertion, towards the evening of this day, the uneasiness of her uncertainty grew almost intolerable. The next morning she had promised Delvile to set out for London, and he expected the morning after to claim her for his wife. Yet Mr. Monkton neither sent nor came, and she knew not if her letter was delivered, or as if still he was unprepared for the disappointment by which he was awaited. A secret regret for the unhappiness she must occasion him, which silently yet powerfully reproached her, stole fast upon her mind, and poisoned its tranquillity. For though her opinion was invariable in holding his proposal to be wrong, she thought too highly of his character to believe he would have made it but from a mistaken notion it was right. She painted him, therefore, to herself as glowing with indignation, accusing her of inconsistency, and perhaps suspecting her of coquetry, and imputing her change of conduct to motives the most trifling and narrow, till with resentment and disdain he drove her wholly from his thoughts. In a few minutes, however, the picture was reversed. Delvile no more appeared stormy nor unreasonable. His face wore an aspect of sorrow, and his brow was clouded with disappointment. He forbore to reproach her, but the look which her imagination delineated was more piercing than words of severest import. These images pursued and tormented her, drew tears from her eyes, and loaded her heart with anguish. Yet when she recollected that her conduct had had in view an higher motive than pleasing Delvile, she felt that it ought to offer her a higher satisfaction. She tried, therefore, to revive her spirits by reflecting upon her integrity, and refused all indulgence to this enervating sadness, beyond what the weakness of human nature demands, as some relief to its sufferings upon every fresh attack of misery. A conduct such as this was the best antidote against affliction, whose arrows are never with so little difficulty repelled, as when they light upon a conscience which no self-reproach has laid bare to their malignancy. Before 6 o'clock the next morning, her maid came to her bedside with the following letter, which she told her had been brought by an express. To Miss Beverley. May this letter, with one only from Delvile Castle, be the last that Miss Beverley may ever receive. Yet sweet to me as is that hope, I write in the utmost uneasiness. I have just heard that a gentleman whom, by the description that is given of him, I imagine is Mr. Monckton, has been in search of me with a letter which he was anxious to deliver immediately. Perhaps this letter is from Miss Beverley. Perhaps it contains directions which ought instantly to be followed. Could I divine what they are, with what eagerness would I study to anticipate their execution. It will not, I hope, be too late to receive them on Saturday, when her power over my actions will be confirmed, and when every wish she will communicate shall be gratefully, joyfully, and with delight fulfilled. I have sought Belfield in vain. He has left Lord Vanelt, and no one knows whither he is gone. I have been obliged, therefore, to trust a stranger to draw up the bond, but he is a man of good character, and the time of secrecy will be too short to put his discretion in much danger. Tomorrow, Friday, I shall spend solely in endeavouring to discover Mr. Monkton. I have leisure sufficient for the search, since so prosperous has been my diligence that everything is prepared. I have seen some lodgings in Pall Mall, which I think are commodious and will suit you. Send a servant, therefore, before you to secure them. If upon your arrival I should venture to meet you there, be not, I beseech you, offended or alarmed. I shall take every possible precaution neither to be known nor seen, and I will stay with you only 3 minutes. The messenger who carries this is ignorant from whom it comes, for I fear his repeating my name among your servants, and you could scarce return to me with an answer before you will yourself be in town. Yes, loveliest Cecilia, at the very moment you receive this letter, the chaise will, I flatter myself, be at the door, which is to bring to me a treasure that will enrich every future hour of my life. And oh, as to me, it will be exhaustless. May but its sweet dispenser experience some share of the happiness she bestows, and then what, save her own purity, will be so perfect, so unsullied as the felicity of her M.D. The perturbation of Cecilia upon reading this letter was unspeakable. Mr. Monkton, she found, had been wholly unsuccessful. All her heroism had answered no purpose, and the transaction was as backward as before she had exerted it. She was now, therefore, called upon to think and act entirely for herself. Her opinion was still the same, nor did her resolution waver, yet how to put it in execution she could not discern. To write to him was impossible, since she was ignorant where he was to be found. To disappoint him at the last moment she could not resolve, since such a conduct appeared to her unfeeling and unjustifiable. For a few instants she thought of having him waited for at night in London with a letter, but the danger of entrusting any one with such a commission, and the uncertainty of finding him, should he disguise himself, made the success of this scheme too precarious for trial. One expedient alone occurred to her, which, though she felt to be hazardous, she believed was without an alternative. This was no other than her hastening to London herself, consenting to the interview he had proposed in Pall Mall, and then, by strongly stating her objections, and confessing the grief they occasioned her, to pique at once his generosity and his pride upon releasing her himself from the engagement into which he had entered. She had no time to deliberate. Her plan, therefore, was decided almost as soon as formed, and every moment being precarious, she was obliged to awaken Mrs. Charlton, and communicate to her at once the letter from Delvile, and the new resolution she had taken. Mrs. Charlton, having no object in view but the happiness of her young friend, with a facility that looked not for objections, and scarce saw them when presented, agreed to the expedition, and kindly consented to accompany her to London. For Cecilia, however concerned to hurry and fatigue her, was too anxious for the sanction of her presence to hesitate in soliciting it. A chaise, therefore, was ordered, and with post-horses for speed, and 2 servants on horseback, the moment Mrs. Charlton was ready, they set out on their journey. Scarce had they proceeded 2 miles on their way, when they were met by Mr. Monkton, who was hastening to their house. Amazed and alarmed at a sight so unexpected, he stopped the chaise to inquire whither they were going. Cecilia, without answering, asked if her letter had yet been received. I could not, said Mr. Monckton, deliver it to a man who was not to be found. I was this moment coming to acquaint how vainly I had sought him. But still that your journey is unnecessary and less voluntary, since I have left it at the house where you told me you should meet tomorrow morning, and where he must then unavoidably receive it. Indeed, sir, cried Cecilia, tomorrow morning will be too late. In conscience, in justice, and even in decency too late. I must therefore go to town. Yet I go not, believe me, in opposition to your injunctions, but to enable myself, without treachery or dishonour, to fulfil them. Mr. Monkton, aghast and confounded, made not any answer, till Cecilia gave orders to the postilion to drive on. He then hastily called to stop him, and began the warmest expostulations. But Cecilia, firm when she believed herself right, though wavering when fearful where she was wrong, told him it was now too late to change her plan, and repeating her orders to the postilion, left him to his own reflections, grieved herself to reject his counsel, yet too intently occupied by her own affairs and designs to think long of any other. We will pause there. Have a good evening.